So America's weird. We are the richest democracy with the worst poverty. And that's something that's always troubled me. I know it's troubled a lot of you. And I wanted to understand the role that housing plays in that story. So I thought looking at folks getting evicted, looking at folks physically thrown out of their homes was a decent way of going about that. So I started this work the old-fashioned way. I moved into a trailer park on the far south side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Anyone from Milwaukee in the room? Yes, love. And lived in this trailer for about 5 months, and then I moved into a room in a rooming house on the north side of the city. That's the inner city of Milwaukee. And I lived there for about 10 months. And from those two neighborhoods, I followed families getting evicted. I went everywhere with those families. I went to eviction court with them, followed them into shelters and abandoned homes, slept on their floors, watched their kids, went to a bunch of funerals, and was even there for a birth. Like there for a birth, you know what I mean, Michael? Like it was intense. But I knew that to fully understand how the low-income housing market worked, I needed to get landlords' perspectives too. So if you were getting evicted, I wanted to get just as close to your landlord doing the evicting, and I did. So I went to eviction court with landlords too, and I helped them collect rents and pass out eviction notices, and I learned what makes them tick and what ticks them off, and kind of try to write a book about this incredibly complicated and fraught relationship that between landlords and tenants. But I was going along, there are all these questions that kept springing to mind, like how often does eviction happen? Who does it happen to? So I knew I needed to go after some data to get my hands around those questions. So one thing I did is surveyed 1,100 renters all over the city of Milwaukee. We went into some of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city, and we went to some of the most troubled neighborhoods in the city. I had an interviewer mugged. One was bit by a dog. It's actually the same guy, Michael. Steve. Steve needs to work on his situational awareness. But we worked really hard for those data, and we got an 84% response rate. And the things that I was learning on the ground, living with families in the trailer park or in the city, were deeply informing those efforts. I'm a PhD in sociology. I teach sociology at Harvard, and the book draws on all the cutting-edge research in economics and political science and sociology and applies that to these issues. It analyzes hundreds of thousands of eviction records, draws on multiple surveys, and tries to put that big data into a conversation with the small data, the things that I was seeing every day living on the ground. And I think in that way, the book really starts on the ground and ends on the ground. It's written in the spirit of narrative nonfiction, and here it draws on the humanities and journalism and literature. And so it follows 8 families through the process of eviction. And let me just kind of share one family's story real quickly with you. So Arlene had this 14-year-old son, Jory, and one day he and his cousin were throwing snowballs at passing cars, and Jory smacked this car with a snowball, and this man jumped out. It was and they ran into Arlene's house and locked the door, and the man followed them there and kicked the door in. And thank God he left before anything else happened. But when Arlene's landlord found out about that, she decided to evict Arlene and her boys for damaging property. So Arlene took her 2 sons to the Salvation Army homeless shelter, which everyone calls the Lodge in Milwaukee. Like it's a hotel, so you can tell your kids, we're staying at the Lodge tonight. And from there, she was on the hunt for another place to live. And she found a place on 19th Street, but there was often no water, and Jory had a bucket out, was in the toilet. But Arlene told me it was $5.25 for a whole house, and it was quiet. It was my favorite place. So when I looked at that survey data and we asked what happens to families after they're evicted, one thing that we found is they move into much worse housing and much worse neighborhoods than they lived in before. So if we want to know why some kids live with lead paint, exposed wires, no heat, why they live in neighborhoods with shootings and concentrated poverty, one reason is their families are forced to accept those conditions in the harried aftermath of an eviction. So the city eventually found Arlene's favorite place unfit for human habitation. They boarded up the windows and the doors, and she and the boys were on the hunt for another place to live. And they found a 2-bedroom complex, bottom-level duplex on Atkinson Avenue, and then one on 13th Street and Keefe. And there was a fist-sized hole in the living room window. The carpet was filthy, ground into the floor. The door had to be locked with this ugly wooden plank. But Arlene put on a good face. She hung up curtains, and she took a piece of cloth and stuffed it into the window. So the rent for that kind of place, which is located in a really poor neighborhood, was in Milwaukee, which is our 4th poorest city, it was $550 a month, utilities not included, and that consumed 88% of Arlene's welfare check. And she knew that some months she would have to sell her food stamps to make rent, and the boys would try to get by on oodles and noodles. When you're paying over 80% of your income on rent, there's no extra money for anything. Books for Jory or clothes for Jafaris. Jafaris, who was 6, had this amazing ability to transform like a Moppet or a or like a dog leash into soldiers and tanks locked into battle. So here's the deal, like Arlene is not alone in spending the vast majority of her income on housing costs. There's been this consensus in America that we should spend about 30% of our income on housing. But that is not the case for the majority of poor families today. Rents for families of modest means have gone up. They've gone up by about 70% since 1995, but incomes have been flatlined. In some parts of the country, they've fallen. So there's this widening gap between what families are bringing in and what they have to pay for basic shelter. And then we might ask, well, where's public housing? Where's the government here? And the answer is, it's only for the lucky minority of poor families today. Only about 1 in 4 families who qualifies for housing assistance gets it, which is a situation that would be utterly unthinkable when it comes to meeting other basic needs. Imagine if we turned away 3 in 4 families who applied for food stamps. I'm sorry, we don't have enough money, you just have to go hungry. But that's exactly how we treat low-income families searching for shelter today. And the result is that the majority of poor renting families today spend at least 50% of their income on rent and utilities, and at least 1 in 4 of those families spend over 70% on housing costs. Arlene gave up looking for housing assistance a long time ago, but one day on a whim, she stopped by the housing authority and asked about the list, and she was told by the person behind the counter, like, the list is frozen, because on it were 3,500 families who had applied for rent assistance 5 years ago. It could be totally worse. Like in some of our biggest cities, the waiting list for public housing is not counted in years, it's counted in decades. I've got 2 young kids, so if I applied for public housing today in Washington, D.C., I am totally a grandpa by the time my application comes up for review. So if Arlene wants public housing, this is what she'd have to do. She'd have to wait 3 or 4 years till the list unfroze, wait another 3 or 4 years till her name made it to the top of the pile, and then she just straight pray that the person reviewing her application would ignore all the evictions she's collected while trying to make ends meet unassisted in the private market. This is a young person's issue just as much as it's Arlene's. Many of our students are facing housing insecurity too. I've been around the country for this last year. I've met a lot of students who are living in cars, doubling up, and the students who are graduating, guess where the good jobs are? They're in really expensive cities. This is a young person's issue that we need to kind of get our students around the table about. So Arlene painted the walls on 13th Street, but not long after moving in, her sister died, and she pitched in for the funeral. She didn't have any money, but no one else did either, and she gave out of love. The next month, she missed an appointment with her welfare caseworker because the letter announcing the appointment was mailed to one of her previous addresses. And so her check got sanctioned, and she fell 2 months behind, and she got the pink papers. So in Milwaukee, landlords evict about 40 people a day. It's an incredible amount. It's wicked scary, as we say in Boston. But there are other ways, cheaper and quicker ways for a landlord to get you out. I met a landlord that will pay you $200 if you're out by Sunday. I met a landlord that will straight take your door off. We made a lot of effort to try to capture all those informal evictions that never go through the inside of a court. And if you add those up to formal evictions and count things like building condemnations, like what happened to Arlene's favorite place, you learn that every 2 years in Milwaukee, 1 in 8 renters is evicted. 1 in 8. That's crazy. That's insane. We've now crunched the numbers in Cleveland, Chicago, Kansas City. New York City sees 60 martial evictions every single day. I'm in the process of building the nation's first ever eviction lab, so if you invite me to Anchorage, Alaska, or Omaha, or anywhere, I want to have eviction statistics for your community, and we'll have those by the end of the summer. This seems like a widespread problem. The last time we asked in the American Housing Survey, do you think you'll be evicted soon? 2.8 million renters said yes. Eviction affects the young and the old, affects the sick and the able-bodied, but the face of our eviction epidemic is moms with kids. It's moms with kids. Until recently, the South Bronx Housing Court had a daycare inside of it because there are so many kids coming through its doors. And low-income African-American women like Arlene are evicted at incredibly high rates. Among Milwaukee renters, 1 in 5 black women reports being evicted sometime in her life, compared to 1 in 15 white women. That should shock us. This is like the feminine equivalent to incarceration. We know that many of our poor African-American men are being swept up by the arm of the criminal justice system, being locked up. Many of our poor African-American women are being locked out, and they're disproportionately bearing the brunt of the eviction crisis. And here the book culminates in these intersections that are incredibly important to the American story about race and class and gender and social justice and the law. This is also not a problem just on the north side of Milwaukee or the south side of Chicago. This is in poor white communities, which I write about a lot in Evicted, and it's in poor immigrant communities as well. It's in expensive cities on the coast and pretty inexpensive cities in the middle of the country. 1 in 5 of all Americans who rent now spend over 50% of their income on housing. So the judge in housing court ordered Arlene to be out on a day in early January. I don't know what early January is like in Atlanta, but it's pretty cold in Milwaukee. It was like really, really cold. The weatherman said it could drop below 40 with the wind chill. But if Arlene waited any longer, the sheriff would come with a team of movers, and they would have piled everything on the sidewalk. So she struck out into the cold. She found another room and another shelter, and her and the boys were on the hunt for another place to live. And so Arlene called on or applied to 20 apartments, and then 40, and 60, and then 80. I counted. She was accepted to none of them. But finally, Mr. 90, the 90th landlord, said yes. He had a 1-bedroom apartment, 525. Arlene didn't much consider what the place looked like, what the neighborhood was like. A house is a house, she told Jory. So 2 months after her eviction court hearing, they moved in, and Arlene liked it. You know, she got her stuff out of storage. She hung pictures on the wall. She put a little sign over the sink to Jory that said, "If you don't clean up after yourself, we're going to have problems." So you guys remember what it's like to be 14? Totally brutish and sucky. And it's hard to be 14 and experience long stretches of homelessness. Between 7th and 8th grades, Jory went to 5 different schools. And at his new school, he started acting out a bit. And one day, a teacher yelled at him. And he kicked her in the shin. And he ran home. And the teacher called the principal, but then she called the police. And when officers paid Arlene and the boys a visit, and the landlord found out about that, he told her she had to go. Kids are a big part of this story. They can prolong the time you're homeless after your eviction. They sometimes are the reason you get evicted. We did this study in housing court because we wanted to know, why do you get evicted but you don't, even though you owe your landlord the exact same amount? And what we found was that it's kids. If you live with kids, the chances of you getting evicted triple in housing court. And what you're seeing in that finding is landlord discretion. Now, after that eviction, Arlene started to unravel a little bit. She told me, "It's like I got a curse on me. It won't stop for nothing. Sometimes I find my body trembling or shaking, tired, but I can't sleep. I'm fixing to have a nervous breakdown. My body's trying to shut down." I recently published a study that showed that moms who get evicted experience higher rates of depression 2 years later. And we know that between 2005 and 2010, years where housing costs all around the country were soaring, something else was going up too, and those were suicides attributed to eviction. And here's where the book intersects with biology and psychology and mental health, and how like social infrastructure and health disparities are deeply connected. Arlene went on to tell me, "Just my soul is messed up. I wish my life were different. I wish that when I be an old lady, I can sit back and look at my kids and they be grown and they, become something, and we'll all be together and be laughing. We'll be remembering stuff like this and be laughing at it." I think the home is the center of life. In languages spoken all over the world, the word for home encompasses not just shelter, but warmth and family, community, the womb. An eviction erases all that. And we've moved from a place where evictions used to be rare in this country, where they used to draw crowds, to a place where eviction is incredibly commonplace in low-income communities, destabilizing their homes, their schools, and their entire communities. They're not just a condition of poverty, they're a cause of it. They're making things worse, and they're leaving a deep and jagged scar in the next generation, which means we can't fix poverty in America without fixing housing. So how do we fix it? I think this is where our students have to come in. And one thing that my family and I have done with proceeds from this book is start an organization called Just Shelter, which broadcasts community organizations all around the country putting in work on these issues. So your students can learn about the issue in their own backyard, and they can get involved in their own way. We also need a lot of folks around the tables. Students who are artists have created things in response to eviction. Architects have gotten involved. Computer science majors have brought their skills to help families like design new apps to find new housing and that kind of thing. We need a lot of people around this table. We don't need to outsmart the problem as much as out-hate it. And I think a lot of students are interested in that conversation because whatever our way out of this mess, one thing is certain, this degree of inequality and this blunting of human potential, this cold denial of human dignity, this isn't us. And this doesn't need to be us. By no American value is this situation justified. There's no piece of scripture or holy teaching or ethical code that can be summoned to defend what we allowed our country to become. Thanks.